Yeah. So, welcome and encourage any correction to my data and findings. I also apologize if I repeat myself at all. I want to start off by first defining what I mean by a UBI, or Universal Basic Income. At the root, it is simply an income that goes to everyone of a population with absolutely zero stipulations. The way it is exactly implemented can vary depending on who is conceiving it. For instance, how do you actually get the money distributed? Direct deposit? Checks? What is to stop someone from trying to claim more than one check? Is it monthly? Yearly? Most importantly, how exactly do you go about funding it or deciding how much it really is? Does it vary depending on where you live according to cost of living? All of these are very important components which I will try to address in this talk, but some may be a bit too niche for me to be able to answer sufficiently. So I will do my best to stick to the topic of if one is feasible, should we have it? That being said, one thing I've learned is that the devil is definitely in the details when it comes to convincing people if an idea is actually a good idea. Most people are for eradicating poverty and human suffering, but very few seem to be able to agree upon ideas that might actually work. I have talked to my mom quite a bit about UBI and recently found out that I had convinced her it was a good idea, except my plan at the time did involve absolving many current welfare programs, which she wasn't in favor of and would not support. So implementation is important, and I will cover the possible implementations as best I can. First, this is not an implementation, but this is what has been implemented. There have been a few programs which one would call a UBI. However, a true UBI has never been tested simply because part of the beauty of a UBI is that it assures people that they will never have to worry about paying to exist ever again in the future or now, which is very important because half of the benefit of the UBI is the psychological relief of stress, usually caused by worrying about personal survival. Obviously, as a species, we will always have to worry about surviving. But the closer any individual is to that worry, the more their brain power and therefore their time and energy have to be devoted to it instead of literally anything else. The Alaska oil dividend is a good example of the spirit of a UBI. It is a check that Alaskans receive every year that can range from a few $100s to over $2,000, depending on the state of the fund that year. It is funded by the revenue of the oil and gas industry in Alaska. Most people use it to make their lives more livable by doing things like heating their house with it, or buying extra supplies for the winter months when the elements cut some residents off from the rest of the world. I really like this implementation because it hits the nail on the head of what a UBI really is. If you take the resources of a society that are in abundance and redistribute them equally, you end up with a far healthier and happier society. There are people in Alaska who say the dividend allows them to live there at all, which means that without it, Alaska wouldn't have as rich a culture as it does. Canada ran a UBI trial back in the 1970s in a few small towns. The project was called MINCOME, which is short for minimum income. It was a social experiment to see what the effects of a UBI were. It lasted for 5 years and paid a family of 4 what would be equivalent of 16,000 loonie a year today. When it ended, the new government in place did not care for it, so they archived the results and virtually forgot about it until recently. The results that showed that there was not a significant drop in the amount of work being done. The demographics that did back off of work were teen boys who now could finish school and mothers who now could stay at home with their kids. What also happened is that people made investments in themselves, like buying a new farm truck that was reliable. One interesting aspect of this UBI, which is something we could feasibly do with our current welfare system, was to subtract half of any money you made extra from your benefit. So if you make $1,000, you lose 500 of the benefit. This would in theory eliminate our current welfare bubble, but would still not address the psychological aspect that I mentioned before. Finland also ran a program that was called a UBI, but honestly, by my account, it was far from it. First, it was not nearly enough to survive on at 560 euros a month, which would be close to the same in US dollars. That's about like 640. Second, it was only given to people who were unemployed at the time and was aimed at giving incentive to go to work and not simply just creating a healthier society. Third, and most important, is that it was treated like it was going to be an instant cure-all and only lasted 2 years. As more of a short-term experiment to compare individuals who received it with people in similar situations who did not. They found that it did not send people to work any more than the control group. The people who received the benefit but still didn't go to work had other barriers like health issues or outdated skill sets. Of course, a 2-year program that pays nearly nothing will not address these underlying issues, but a long-term cost of living UBI could, very much so. In this study, they did find that it made people happier and less stressed. The phrase that money does not buy happiness is only relevant when it comes to excess, when it comes to the difference between food and starvation, housing or homelessness. Money absolutely does buy happiness in the form of removing a huge source of stress and anxiety. This example here is not quite a UBI, but is part of one of its tenants. In Salt Lake City, they essentially bought homeless people houses because doing so saved them more money than had they not. Back to brain power allocation and survival, there is bountiful evidence that the poor make bad decisions because anyone in poverty makes bad decisions. It takes a lot of energy and brain power to just survive in those situations, much less plan for the future. Poverty causes lack of cognitive ability, not the other way around. Okay, so on to reasons why I personally support a UBI. There are people alive today who didn't earn the entirety of their wealth, or conversely, do anything to deserve the poverty that they are living. This is because it's really hard to design a system that perfectly tracks how much you deserve, because that would require knowing what all changes you face and what all challenges you face, and exactly how hard you tried to overcome them. What a basic income does is ensure that everyone receives something close to a fair share of the massive social, and technological infrastructure that our ancestors have created. I believe this equal distribution is necessary for a healthy and just society, because any other method of distribution would always rely, at least in part, on luck. And that just won't do when not having a fair share can land you in poverty. We have laws on the books that say, in essence, that there should be no cruel and unusual punishment. I believe that poverty is never a justified punishment for anything. Many people might know this, but Martin Luther King actually supported a UBI. You know, the current mantra is that you eat as much as you work for. Who determines how hard you work? Currently, the free market does, which itself decided that the pool noodle inventor can buy a yacht. But the very women raising our kids, shout out to Kathleen, at home get paid nothing and depend on family, husbands, or handouts for financial support. I can almost get behind the idea of you only eat if you work for it. Almost. But unless we come up with a perfect way to determine if you really worked for it, we need a buffer system that doesn't demean people and doesn't incentivize not working, like our current welfare bubble does by removing benefits after you make so much money. But more importantly, we need a welfare system that has zero effect on a person's sense of self-worth. A UBI could drastically reduce the amount of toxic relationships, in my opinion, by giving those who are oppressed a real means of escaping their oppression in cases where it is hard for them to find their own financial stability. Almost, okay, so I'm commenting on myself because I wrote this like this whole week because I didn't know if I was going to be giving a talk, so I'm proud of myself. But I said almost forgot this bit, but one huge motivation for enacting a UBI is that there will come a point where our current system just no longer works. Technology will replace all jobs that are infrastructure based. Computers and machines are just too good at efficiency. The kinds of jobs that will be left are things that require abstract thought, including art and inventing, among other things. These kinds of jobs under our current system tend to be less than stable, which is why the starving artist is a very real phenomenon. Side note, a UBI strongly supports the gig economy that we currently have, where a lot of professions are behaving like the art industry. I'm gonna take a water break. One could take this data and say, well, then we should just halt the development of technology and stop letting it replace jobs. While that would work at keeping jobs, I think that mindset severely misses the point. The goal isn't to keep jobs, it's to create a life worth living. Things like money and jobs are tools we created to make a better world. When they no longer serve that purpose, you stop fighting to keep them. I believe a UBI is the next step in social evolution, where we learn to stop believing that the meaning of life is productivity and reproduction, but rather things like enlightenment, enjoyment, and many other pursuits we will definitely discover. Another thing I forgot to mention is that I believe a UBI would cause the job market to actually behave more like a market. Markets rely on the ability of the consumer, in this case the worker, to turn down a product altogether. This is not very feasible to most people when it comes to jobs, because most people need more money than the welfare system provides, so they have to have a job. Coincidentally, this is the exact same reason that medicine does not belong in a free market. Kinda hard to turn down a life-saving treatment. A UBI would give workers more than an ability to tell employers that they won't work for them unless they have suitable working conditions. Okay, on to challenges with a UBI. One challenge that I see with getting a government to enact a UBI is that unless it is global, there will be even more people trying to come into our country, and if enough of them are unproductive, it could bring, whoop. It happened, Stephen. I caught it though.
That's great.
Oh, come on, Mr. Laptop. You were working just fine. Stop it. I apologize for technical issues. I'll show you guys. Wait, I can show you guys now. Look at this makeshift podium out of a piano stand, a cardboard box, a drum, and a computer, and my phone is on the computer, so not working with the best of materials. There we go. Stay. Okay, so I just start that over. One challenge that I see with getting a government to enact a UBI is that unless it is global, there will be even more people trying to come into our country. And if enough of them are unproductive, it could be a strain on the system. This is currently the argument against any immigration, and I believe relies on the false premise that most immigrants, or even a substantial portion of them, are unproductive, which ties into my next rebuttal. A concern I get from most people is that a UBI could cause laziness and complacent people. I can see that possibility, but in the trials that were ran, that was not what was observed. In contrast, I believe that laziness is misunderstood, and honestly should be removed from our vocabulary, in my opinion. Laziness is more accurately called unmotivated, and is not a fault of character, but a state of being that can be addressed. Do they feel like no matter what they do, they won't be happy? Do they feel like the cards are stacked against them and see no point in trying? I personally know what it feels like to be unmotivated and know what it feels like to feel powerless. I believe that a guaranteed income would, in a lot of cases, make more people motivated to become the very best that they can be, much like I felt when I was given a beautiful guitar one Christmas and subsequently played my ass off. A UBI was once experimented with in a very poor African community, and what was found there is that the only people who stopped working were kids, because now they can go to school, much like what happened in the Canadian experiment. My current thoughts on the worry that a UBI could reduce motivation is that as long as it isn't enough to live an overly lavish lifestyle, but it's just enough to not fear being without other sources of income, it will act exactly in the way that I predict, making happier yet still motivated people. If it does reduce motivation, it will only be temporary in most cases, because most of us who are jaded from being wage slaves will take some very much needed me time. As for the few who may remain unmotivated, not only can any system sustain some abuse, but I believe if we also do our best to help our neighbors and start taking mental health seriously, virtually all people will be some very real measure of productive. Not that productivity is the point of life. One objection that I've heard more than once about a completely universal income is, why give the money to the rich who don't need it? While I understand this complaint, the people making this statement miss the point as well. A huge problem with a lot of current welfare systems is precisely the means testing itself and the moral implications that they bring. Often there is a sense of being lesser value simply because one needs help. Sometimes this causes people who need help to not seek it out, and then for those who do seek help, it can make them feel less confident in themselves, making them unhappy, and in reference to an economy, less productive. This loss of productivity is most often greater than the price of UBI, making not paying people more expensive than paying them. A workaround of not giving it to people who don't need it, other than how the Canadians did it, is to maybe make it something one can opt out of if they so choose. But I digress. The productivity and happiness caused by giving everyone a very, very solid financial floor is far greater than the temporary financial cost of a UBI, and would pay for itself many times over, in my opinion. As for the absolute biggest rebuttal and concern of all, funding, I have two key points to make here. First, it is an investment. Think of it like people are children, because really we are, and we need help most of the time. When a parent pays for their child's health care, or their food, or their education, or anything of that sort, they understand that financial trouble now pays for itself by giving the world another healthy adult. When you don't help your children, they often end up with barriers that lead them to cost either you or society later in life. People are the exact same when it comes to finances. Let someone be homeless, and we lose their potential. Let someone spend most of their time worrying about how to pay bills, and we lose who might have had the mind to cure cancer. Often the people who are able to do the most in life do not start out with a multitude of barriers. Of course, there are exceptions, but they are just that, exceptions. Second, nope, too far. Come back. This goes back to what I said about us benefiting from what people of the past have done, that we should all benefit from equally. The way to wealth is usually hard work and luck. Rich people think it's only hard work, and poor people think it's only luck. Therefore, we all usually hate each other mutually. In order to get closer to a truly just system, we need to unanimously recognize both aspects. In the case for funding a UBI, the profoundly wealthy need to realize that a part of their wealth was solely amassed due to luck. Either they were part of a family legacy, they were lucky enough to have good mentors, they were lucky enough to have created something that enough people wanted to buy, they were lucky enough to have very good mental health, or any of many other privileges that one can have but not realize how much it is indeed a privilege. Since there is luck involved, it is honestly inhumane to use our current system to determine how comfortable a life someone gets to live. With all of this in mind, my personal preference for funding a UBI is by viewing it as more a wealth gap compressor that is almost exclusively funded by the most wealthy, so that as long as there are people who can afford to live like kings, no other person in that society should ever, under any circumstances, be without what would be considered basic creature comforts of the time. I find of the time important because societies change in structure, and much like internet access is almost a necessity to live in the modern society, as well as reliable mode of transportation, so are things in future societies that we can't even imagine yet. I'm not proposing a wealth cap per se, but a tax that limits the difference in wealth that the most rich in a society can have compared to the poorest, because the ability to be comfortable should be shared within a society, when in that society, the means to comfort has any basis in luck. That was one heck of a run-on sentence. This, of course, is not the only method of funding that I'm open to, just the most to the point of what I think a UBI should be for. In conclusion, this is a redundant statement too. At the end of the day, I absolutely see the importance of being concerned with the ins and outs, but I think one can get so deep into them that they fail to take a step back and see how many possibilities there actually are outside of one's own current method of existence. For me, I see a world of abundance. Our ancestors, as well as ourselves, have done a tremendous job of getting us out of caves, curing diseases, giving humans what would have at one point been seen as godlike capabilities with airplanes, cars, smartphones, and so much more technology. We live in a time where we have the technical ability for no one on this planet to live in anything less than comfortable environments. The only issue is that we haven't yet decided to see allowing people to live without these things as a crime against humanity. Do you want to stop wars? Give people a life that is less filled with fear and more filled with abundance. Do you want people to stop robbing stores and committing hate crimes? Give them hope and soothe their fears. The privileges that a UBI would bring are no different than the privileges we currently have in most modern societies. It's just that we have normalized our current privileges and have yet to normalize a UBI. There is often this idea that millennials are spoiled and entitled people because of our current tech. I actually agree, but in context. Let me explain. Every single generation where there is a development in everyday human life, the generation previous says the current generation is spoiled. Every single time. I wonder what was said about the first generation who didn't have to walk to the river to get water, but instead had a convenient valve in their house to turn it on and off at their leisure. I doubt many people would use this as a reason to stop running water from existing. I feel the same way about all developments in everyday comfort. Yes, they take away the need for people to do a thing, but they grant new possibilities like sanitation and conservation of time in the case of running water. Uh-oh, my voice is trying to kill me. Water break number 2. Let me start that sentence over. They take away the need for people to do a thing, but they grant new possibilities like sanitation and conservation of time in the case of running water, and then freedom from unnecessary anxiety and the gift of abundance of autonomy in the case of UBI. I see a world where physically we have the capability to give everyone a decent standard of living, and I believe the benefits of doing so are nearly innumerable. There are many systems one could dream up to achieve this goal, but many would require drastically changing the entire economy. I believe a UBI could achieve this goal very well, and with careful planning, is capable of being implemented into our current economic system. The world is not inherently fair, it would seem, but as fairly logical, sentient beings, we can always be working to make it as fair as possible.